For 27 years, the world ran on a simple rule: dollars for gold. Then, on a Sunday night in 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window, and almost nobody noticed the world had just changed forever. In 1971, money stopped being backed by anything, and almost nobody noticed. For 27 years, the world had lived under a simple rule. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. You wanted to trade, you needed dollars, you wanted to trust the dollar, there was a building full of gold you could come and collect. The system worked because there was a single point of trust at the center of it. Not a promise, not a signature, but a physical metal sitting in a vault. Then, on a Sunday evening in August, President Richard Nixon went on live television and told Americans something no president had ever told them before. Starting tomorrow, you can no longer exchange dollars for gold. He called it a temporary measure. The gold window was never reopened. More than 50 years have passed. By every law of economics, the dollar should have collapsed within months. Instead, 2 years later, it was stronger than it had ever been. Not because America found more gold, but because America found something better: oil. This is the story of how a single deal made in the desert between a diplomat and a royal family replaced the gold standard with an oil standard, and why the consequences of that deal still shape global politics today. To understand what happened in 71, you have to go back to 44, when the rules were still being written. July 1944, a small town called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. The war hadn't ended yet, but representatives from 44 countries had already gathered to decide how the world was going to be organized once it did. The result was a system named after the town: the dollar pegged to gold, every other currency pegged to the dollar. America at that time controlled about 20,000 tons of gold, roughly two-thirds of the world's entire supply. And that made the dollar the only currency the world could trust without question. The Bretton Woods system worked for 27 years. It worked because America stuck to the rules. And then America started spending more than it had: the Vietnam War social programs, the arms race. The Federal Reserve printed dollars faster than the gold reserves grew. And by the late 60s, there were far more dollars in the world than there was metal to back them. By 71, more than half of America's gold was gone. On paper, the reserves were worth $10 billion. Foreign governments held $40 billion in claims against them, 4 of promises for every $1 of metal. And someone noticed. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, a man who never had any problem telling America uncomfortable truths, publicly announced in 65 that France intended to convert its dollar reserves into gold. He called the dollar's privileged position an exorbitant privilege, le privilège exorbitant, a phrase that has since entered the economic vocabulary permanently and still appears in every textbook on international finance. And de Gaulle didn't just talk. He started taking France's gold back physically. 2 years before the public announcement, in 63, he had quietly launched a secret operation codenamed Vidjus, which literally translates as empty the pockets. Over 3 years, France pulled 3,313 tons of gold out of the vaults of the Federal Reserve in New York City and the Bank of England in London. It took dozens of trips by ocean liner across the Atlantic and over 100 flights to deliver all of it back to the vaults of the Bank of France in Paris. De Gaulle didn't trust the Americans enough to leave French gold on their territory. He was afraid that when the moment came, it could be used as leverage. The French were right. Gold went from $35 an ounce to over $800 by 1980. Anyone who held dollars lost 96% of their value. Anyone who held gold multiplied their wealth more than 20-fold. De Gaulle didn't live to see it. He died in 70. But the bet he made turned out to be one of the best financial decisions of the 20th century. By the early 70s, France wasn't alone anymore. United Kingdom, Switzerland, others, they all saw the same math: too many dollars, not enough metal. The reserves at Fort Knox were melting away. And on Friday, August 13th, 1971, Nixon called 15 of his closest advisors to Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. His chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, organized the meeting in a single day and gave everyone one instruction: don't tell anyone where you're going, not even your families. When they arrived, the rule got stricter: no phones, no outside contact. The decision being made over that weekend was going to change the meaning of money forever, and not a single person outside that compound was going to know about it until it was already done. Nixon arrived by helicopter at 2:29 in the afternoon. Among those gathered were Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Treasury Secretary John Connally, and Undersecretary for International Monetary Affairs Paul Volcker, the same Volcker who 10 years later would become the legendary chairman of the Fed. They argued for 3 days. Burns and Volcker worried about how foreign governments would react. Connally believed that closing the gold window would force other countries to revalue their currencies. Nixon didn't really care what foreign central banks thought. What he cared about was the reaction of American voters. Sunday evening, August 15th, Nixon went on the air. I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, he said. And in 50-plus years, no one has ever undone it. Connally shortly after said something to a group of foreign counterparts that would become one of the most quoted lines in international finance: the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. What happened next would later be called the Nixon shock, and the name turned out to be remarkably accurate because the world really was in shock. The dollar lost more than 20% of its value against major currencies in 2 years. Inflation in America accelerated to the highest levels in a generation. Countries that had spent decades pegging their currencies to the dollar suddenly discovered there was nothing to peg to anymore. The dollar was floating, and nobody knew where it was going to settle. Oil, which had been priced in dollars since the 40s out of pure habit and convenience, started rising rapidly, not because oil was suddenly scarce, but because the dollar it was priced in was getting weaker. Producers were getting the same numbers on paper, but those numbers bought less and less in the real world. And then came war. October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. America supported Israel. In retaliation, the Arab countries of OPEC announced an oil embargo. They cut off shipments to the United States and several Western nations. The price of oil quadrupled in a matter of months. Gasoline became scarce in America. Lines at gas stations stretched for hours. The government rolled out rationing. Cars with even-numbered license plates could fill up on even days, odd plates on odd days. America, the country that had built its post-war economy on cheap gasoline and car culture, suddenly faced the reality that fuel could simply run out. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, so it needed something else. And the world had only one thing left worth backing a global currency with: oil. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh. One side had the world's largest reserves of oil, the other had the most powerful military in history. Both sides needed each other, and both sides knew it. On June 8th, the two countries signed an agreement formally called the Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. In practice, it was the deal that replaced the gold standard. The terms were simple, even though the consequences would be enormous. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively for dollars, not for British pounds, which the Saudis had actually been accepting before that. Not for marks, not for gold. Only dollars. Saudi Arabia would invest its surplus dollar revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively lending the money back to the American government. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, sell them advanced weapons, and help modernize the country. Behind the scenes, according to people who were in those negotiations, there was an unspoken but very clear threat. Plans for a military takeover of the oil fields in the Persian Gulf were being discussed in the White House. This isn't conspiracy talk. It's a fact confirmed by people who sat at that table. The deal happened not just because it was mutually beneficial, but because the alternative was significantly worse for both sides. By 1975, every country in OPEC, not just Saudi Arabia, all of them, was selling oil exclusively for dollars. Henry Kissinger coined the term for the mechanism by which oil revenues flowed back into the American economy through bond purchases, petrodollar recycling. The phrase stuck and is still used today. And here's where you have to stop and understand the scale of what happened, because this is where the entire genius, or depending on your point of view, the entire cynicism of the system lives. Every country in the world that wants to buy oil, and oil is something everyone needs, no exceptions, from Japan to Brazil, from Germany to India, first has to find dollars somewhere. It doesn't matter what your national currency is. It doesn't matter how strong your economy is. To fill up your gas tanks, heat your homes, run your factories, you first go to the foreign exchange market and buy dollars. Demand for the dollar stopped being voluntary. It became mandatory, not because the world trusted the American economy, but because the world physically could not function without oil, and oil was sold only in dollars. America acquired a privilege no other country in history has ever held: the ability to print a currency that the entire world is forced to buy. Don't want to? Too bad. And then there's the second half of the mechanism, which is beautiful in how it closes the loop. You need oil, so you need dollars. You sell oil, so you get dollars. You have too many dollars, so you put them into US Treasury bonds, lending the money back to America. America uses that money to maintain the military bases that keep the oil producing countries safe. And they'll use it to protect their shrine, which means the oil keeps flowing, which means the dollars keep flowing, which means the bonds keep getting bought round and round. Pull one element out, and the whole structure starts to wobble. And here we have to talk about something honestly, because this topic has accumulated a huge pile of conspiracy theories and oversimplifications. I don't want to turn this video into either conspiracy or propaganda, so the facts I'm about to lay out, I'm laying out as they are, with a caveat that I think is necessary. There's a narrative that goes like this: any leader who tried to sell oil in something other than dollars was overthrown or killed. The correlation is obvious. Proven causation is not. But the facts are worth knowing. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq, under the UN Oil for Food program, was switching from dollars to euros for its oil sales. The UN approved it. The volumes were modest, and the UN warned Iraq that the conversion would cost them millions. The price of a barrel had to be lowered by about 10 cents to compensate buyers for the currency exchange fees. But the gesture itself, a public rejection of the dollar, was deliberately demonstrative. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official justification was weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. One of the first decisions of the new government was to reverse oil sales back to dollars. Muammar Gaddafi went further. He didn't just want to sell Libyan oil in another currency. He was promoting the idea of a Pan-African gold-backed dinar, a currency that would free Africa from dependency on both the dollar and the French CFA franc, the currency Paris used to control the economies of its former colonies. At that time, Libya held 143 tons of gold intended to back the project. In 2011, NATO intervened militarily during the Libyan civil war. Gaddafi was killed. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when told of his death, said in a CBS interview a line that would be quoted thousands of times: "We came, we saw, he died," and laughed. Iran trades oil in yuan, rupees, and through barter arrangements. It has been under sanctions in one form or another since 1979. Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro pushed oil trade outside the dollar zone and got sanctioned for its trouble. Are these events directly connected to defending the petrodollar? There's no 100% proof. The reasons behind invasions and interventions are always layered: geopolitics, domestic politics, regional conflicts, oil interests, struggles for influence. But the pattern exists, and pretending it doesn't would be dishonest. Every time a major oil producer publicly walked away from the dollar, serious consequences followed. Make of that what you will, but it's worth knowing. And now, today, because the system built in 1974 is, for the first time in 50 years, showing visible cracks. For 50 years, only dollars. Saudi Arabia would not accept anything else. OPEC would not accept anything else. The world had no other option. And then, in 2023, that changed. For the first time in history, Saudi Arabia began accepting Chinese yuan for oil. The overwhelming majority of transactions still go through in dollars, and that hasn't changed. But the door that had been locked for half a century just got opened. And once a door like that opens, it rarely closes again. The dollar's share of global currency reserves has dropped from over 70% in 2000 to roughly 58% by 2024. The decline is slow but uninterrupted, and the trend is the same every year. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the countries that have joined them are openly discussing the creation of an alternative settlement currency for trade among themselves. Russia, after 2022, is selling oil for rupees, yuan, and Turkish lira. China, the world's largest oil importer, is increasingly pushing for transactions in yuan. And here's a curious detail that says more about the state of the system than any statistic could. The U.S. Treasury still values its gold reserves at 42.22 cents per ounce, a price set in the 1970s, with the market price of gold above $3,000 an ounce in 2025. That line item on the books reads like a relic from a parallel reality. It hasn't been updated in half a century because gold is no longer officially connected to the dollar. The dollar runs on oil now. But, and this isn't unimportant, the dollar is still used in roughly 80% of all global oil transactions. The inertia is enormous. The entire global financial infrastructure, banks, settlement systems, contracts, insurance, is built around the dollar. Replacing it isn't flipping a switch. It's rebuilding the plumbing in an entire house without shutting off the water while someone is showering in every room. The replacement of the petrodollar isn't going to happen in a year, and probably not in 10. But the direction, for the first time in 50 years, is unambiguous. The gold standard lasted 27 years, from 1944 to 1971. The oil standard has now lasted more than 50. It turned out to be more durable because it was tied not to a metal in a vault, but to a resource the world physically cannot run without. You can choose not to buy gold. You cannot choose not to buy oil. But the oil standard has the same vulnerability the gold standard had. It works as long as both sides of the deal play by the rules. The moment one side decides the rules don't suit them anymore, the structure starts to change. France demanded gold in the 60s, and the gold standard was gone within a few years. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan in 2023, and the oil standard got its first public crack. Charles de Gaulle called the dollar's privilege exorbitant. John Connolly said the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. More than half a century has passed, and more countries are deciding that the problem really is theirs, and that it's time to do something about it. Not because they hate America, but because no privilege lasts forever when it depends on the consent of the people paying for it. The question is no longer if the petrodollar will be replaced. The question is who moves first, and whoever does will end up where France ended up in 1963, on the right side of the deal before everyone else realized the deal had changed. If you had to bet right now on what replaces the dollar, write it in the comments before it happens. I'll pin the most interesting answers and subscribe to the Wealth Code.